Welcome to Where Living is a Vacation History Series. My name is Jimmy Johnson, and you can find me on wherelivingisavacation.com and also on Facebook for Where Living is a Vacation. So we do everything history, merchandise, and all that fun stuff about Lake Orion. Today we are at the Square Lake Cemetery, and we're going to be interviewing Cindy Sartori. She's the treasurer of the Square Lake Cemetery. And I'd like to introduce you to her, and she's going to discuss the history of this great cemetery we see off of Joslin Road near the Lake Orion Library. Cindy.
Good afternoon. As you mentioned, my name is Cindy Sartori. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself first. My family moved to Lake Orion in 1968. I have been here most of my life. I left for a short time and was in Rochester and came back. And so I've been back in Lake Orion since 2003. I moved here to be closer to my parents. The way that I got involved with the cemetery here is my father passed away in 2010, and he is buried in the cemetery here. And about 5 years later, my mother passed away. So in the meantime, after my father had passed, my mom and I used to come to the board's annual meeting at the library. They hold it every summer. And after my mother passed, I was asked if I was interested in joining the board, so I agreed. Well, within about 6 months later, the treasurer moved out of town and resigned, and they asked me to be the treasurer. And so the rest is pretty much history. So I've been the treasurer since about 2015.
Great, that's awesome history. I didn't know you were in the area for this long and have some family lineage back, dating back a long time ago. So that's great. Can you enlighten us on the history of the Square Lake Cemetery?
Yes. Originally, this was farmland owned by the Christopher Cole family. Their house is down the street here at 760 Joslin Road, and all of this area here was basically his farmland. So originally, he used his farmland for some friends and neighbors to bury individuals on it. And then in 1866, the land was incorporated as a public cemetery. And Christopher Cole Sr. and Hiram Voorhees deeded 1 acre of this land to be the cemetery. And so it continued on like that, and it was actually incorporated in 1902. And the reason that they incorporated was so that they could have the cemetery continue on in perpetuity. And then it was incorporated again in 1965, and it's been running ever since in perpetuity to continue to be a cemetery and to go on for eternity. The original cemetery was over here to the left, sections A and B, we call them now. Back in about 1912, this area we're standing in here and the area over here, that was added on in about that time. Later on in 1950, the board purchased all the area to the back of the cemetery. We now call that sections E, F, and G. But it wasn't developed back there until about 1998, thereabouts. So the cemetery in totality is just slightly under 4 acres. And we have plots that have been sold in the cemetery. There have been about 1,200 of them. We have buried actually and recorded on Find a Grave about 788 burials. I know there's some more, but we're still working to update that. I don't know exactly how many at this time. And we actually have still 400 spots left that we could sell to individuals. In the future, if we chose to, there is one area that was never developed at the back, and we could go forward to develop that for some more spots if necessary.
Wow, I appreciate that you're taking all the time to link up the names to findagrave.com. There's like you said, like 1,200, and you got like 700 so far.
Yes.
So making your way,
Yes.
you're more than halfway there.
Yeah. They're probably we wouldn't really get up to 1,200 because there's a lot of plots that have been sold, but people aren't buried there, and there's a lot of plots that were sold in the older sections where people will never be buried in the future, because in the days past, people used to buy a whole block, which at the time was 8 spots, and then they would move out of town or whatever and didn't give their spots to someone else, and so they weren't really buried in. So in these times, some of the spots looked empty, but we wouldn't want to sell it because we'd be concerned that someone was buried there.
Gotcha. Understand. So we're standing in front of the Tyler building right now, and it's an interesting building because every time I drive by here, this is the main building that jumps out to me all the time, and I always wondered about what is this building and what is in this building. So I've wanted to find out, and Cindy's got the answer for us.
Okay, so it's quite a story, but I'll tell you about him. So of course Tyler's on the top there, and it regards a man named Noah Tyler, and he was born in 1821 and he died in 1885 of cancer of the stomach. He had been the secretary of the Oakland County Agricultural Society for 15 years. 2 years before he passed away, he wrote his will, and what's interesting, there's about 8 sections to his will. The third section down, he gives his watch and his gold chain to Christopher Cole, who started the cemetery. And I should have probably mentioned before, the cemetery was originally called Cole Cemetery. People always referred to it as Cole Cemetery. Old death certificates will show either Cole Station or Cole Cemetery on it, and then later it became Square Lake when they incorporated later on. But anyway, he gave his gold watch and chain to Christopher Cole. The fifth point in the will of his, he gave $100 to the trustees to hold and use the interest on that money to maintain his grave spot, his family plot, and they were supposed to maintain it in perpetuity. Well, it's interesting because that went to court. The court said that was void because it was in violation of the statute of perpetuities in Michigan. It continued on, and later it went to the Supreme Court, and the Michigan legislature amended the Charities Act of 1907. So basically it said that now the bequest would be valid and enforceable. So we have an early logbook from the cemetery, and they did keep that money in place, and every year they recorded what interest it made, and they kept his site up. But I'm not sure how it happened that it went away, but in the 1980s, the board of directors set up a fund for maintenance, and it would be held in perpetuity. So in 1980s, the board gave $10,000, and that money was invested, and now it's a lot more money because they add to it all the time when they get extra money. So they add to that fund, and the idea of it is that the cemetery will continue on in the future based on the interest from that money. So you could never spend the money that is in the fund, you can only spend the interest. In the future, when the cemetery isn't operating and collecting money for plot sales or opening and closings, that's the money that they'll use for it. So anyway, to continue on, so Mr. Tyler gave $4,000 to $5,000 from his estate to erect his monument, and it was to be built within 3 years of his death. Then the seventh thing, he gave everything else to his wife if she remained unmarried. So her name was Mary, and she passed away in 1909. So in January of 1909, Mr. Tyler's half-brother put a petition to the administrator forbidding him to give the residue of the estate to the cemetery. So then that went to court. By the end of the year, the court ruled in favor of the cemetery, and the residue of the estate was given to the cemetery. So it amounted to $9,284.86. But the cemetery didn't get the money until 1912. That's how long it took from the end of 1909 to 1912 to actually go through court and give them the money. So when they got the money, they contracted with the E.T. Barnum Corporation of Detroit to build the fencing around the cemetery. So some of that fencing here is still original. The fencing down the north side, or down the north side and the south side is all original. The entryway arches and the gates on each side of it are also original still. On the 12th of March in 1913, they contracted with Sheldon Granite Company to build this building. And Mr. Tyler had given the money and said the cemetery trustees could build any kind of building that they felt was necessary for their use.
Okay.
So a lot of people think that this is a crypt and Mr. Tyler's buried in it, but it is not. It's the receiving vault. So it was used in the winter for people to gather and maybe hold prayer if the weather wasn't good, or to hold the body until such time that they could dig in the frozen ground. So when the building was built, I have the original contract of the building, and the specifications were very much spelled out. And the building originally had a bronze door with glass in it and some bronze windows. And unfortunately, over time, somebody stole that. So we don't really use the building for any purpose now. In it is a machine that is used to thaw the ground in the winter if it's necessary. And so that's the only use at this time for the building.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's a lot of information. I didn't know that about Tyler, and I really thought he was in there. He's not in there.
No,
So that's good.
He's not in there.
He's not in there, but he's got an elaborate plot, which we'll visit over in the south side of the cemetery as well. So, like with Tyler, was he a farmer perhaps, or did he have a farmland or a farmhouse, or?
When he was the secretary of the Agricultural Society, he actually lived in Pontiac for quite a few years before he died. But he was also into he was into real estate, and he held an office in Lake Orion.
Okay, good. Wow, good to know. My next question, I always wonder this, and who is the oldest person that is resting in place in this cemetery? I guess the first to be buried here, would it be Cole, or?
Okay, I know of a couple. First of all, the earliest burial in here is over in this section, and it was a little girl. Her name was Fanny Dickman, and she was approximately 2 years old, and she was buried in 1847. So that was well before the 1866 that they made it into a public cemetery. And back in the 80s, the Historical Society documented all the markers in the cemetery. At that time, there was a marker for little Fanny Dickman.
Yeah.
But around 2004, it was some of the markers that were here in the 80s. When they went through and reviewed again, the markers weren't here anymore for whatever reason. It's possible that her marker is underground, because I found other markers where the ground has settled over them. So that's possible. It is my mission to find the marker for little Fanny Dickman, or to give her a marker. So I have paid a lot of attention to that. As far as the person that is buried in the cemetery that was born the furthest back in time, is over here as well. and his name was Richard Beckley, and he was from England, and he was born in approximately 1776. And that's the oldest one that we have, and a couple more in the 1789, 1805, that early time. And then the person that I believe was the oldest person, had lived the longest and was buried in the cemetery, is Walter Gengel. He lived to be 101 years old. And I believe it was the Orion Review wrote up an article about him and of all of that he had done in the town over the years. But his is also over in Section A, the first part. And like I said, he was 101. That's the person who lived longest, as far as I know.
Wow, that is amazing. Well, next we're going to go visit some of the plots of some of the early pioneers, settlers of Lake Orion. Okay, so we're here over at Christopher Cole's headstone here, senior, the one that started this whole cemetery. Cindy, I had a question. So I see the huge headstone, and I see that it's Christopher Cole on this side inscribed, and the other side is his wife Leah Kinney. But I also noticed smaller ones that say father and mother. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so back in the day, the way that they did it was they sold plots in blocks of spaces. So originally when the cemetery started, they sold what was called a lot, and it actually included 8 spaces. Over time, when they developed the newer part of the cemetery over here, it was sold in lots that were 6 spaces because caskets were bigger, and so they needed more space in the future. But back in the day, when they had wooden boxes and they needed less room, they plotted it out and sold in groups of 8. So a lot of these families here put a big monument on what they would call their family plot. But then they put smaller ones to show maybe if it was, they would sometimes name son or daughter, father, mother. And they didn't really put their names on it. You would just have to assume that it's the person next to the large memorial. And so the way the cemetery is set up, that is a standard from over time, is the stones are headstones, and they are at the head, and they are to the west of where the person is buried. So the person's feet are to the east. So Mr. and Mrs. Cole are actually buried on the other side of this monument. And that's how they all are in the cemetery. So if you see a marker memorial, the person is actually buried to the other side, to the east of it.
Oh, that's interesting. So probably other cemeteries adopted the same set of rules and stuff like that.
That's generally how cemeteries were laid out, in the same fashion, with the west and the east and the people facing the same way. And generally the husband is buried, if you're facing the headstone this way, the husband is buried on the left and the wife is buried on the right, and it is as the way that they would walk down the aisle when they get married.
Oh, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that. I also noticed there's many Cole plots here. Christopher Cole, also named Christopher Cole Jr., mm-hmm. the son, is also at one of these headstones, and many other Coles as well. So a little history for Coles. Cindy mentioned that the original house is right down the road across from the library approximately, mm-hmm. and you still see the original cement pillars to the driveway. So Cole Sr. is married to Leah Kinney, which she's right here. She passed in 1858. Cole passed away in 1873. They're originally from New Jersey. They had 7 children, and when they moved here, they were one of the first inhabitants in this area. So the closest neighbors, I guess you could say, would be 3 miles away. So it's a far distance, and they had a lot of wild animals, and there's still Indians in the area too. So it's very interesting. He was a farmer, a carpenter, and owned like 250 plus acres of land in this area on both sides of Joslin here, up to Square Lake. So it's very interesting, and also having a post office named after you, being in this area, that's quite extraordinary. So he had the coal station, and the coal post office was over on Clarkston Road near the Pollyant Trail, which was the old Pontiac-Oxford Northern Railroad, which is now Pollyant. So it's a very interesting history of coal, and one of our first pioneers to this area. So we're going to move on to the next one. I know there's many more important, prominent people in this area. I think Hadrills are in here too.
Yes.
So let's go take a visit over to Hadrills.
Okay.
Okay, we're at our next plot of one of the original pioneers of Lake Orion, the Hadrills. Cindy, could you tell me something about the Hadrills, or who is actually in this plot, family plot?
Yeah, so this is the Hadrills family plot here. There are a few other ones spread throughout the cemetery, but the original Mr. and Mrs. Hadrill, Isaac and Elizabeth, are buried here. They erected this monument to their spot, and they are buried here where it says mother and father. And Isaac, I believe, passed away in 1902, and Elizabeth a number of years prior. And they had a son named William. He is buried here as well. He is there, and his name is up on the plaque. And there were many others. Next to you is Alfred, another family member, and his family's there.
That's interesting, yeah. And from what I could find online, they had a total of 7 children, 7 Hadrills, and not all of them buried here. And with Isaac, from what I read, he came from England in 1812 on a boat, crossed the ocean, and he got shipwrecked. But he made it. So made it, and he got married to another prominent family here in the area, actually in Pontiac, the Turks. So Elizabeth Turk married Isaac Hadrill, so Elizabeth Hadrill, and she's here, like what Cindy was saying. One of their sons, James Hadrill, was a very prominent person in this area. He was born in 1846. He owned 340 acres of land in this area, did a lot of farming, bred a lot of horses, and he ended up dying in 1911, and he's buried at Oak Hill Cemetery in Pontiac, which made me wonder, like, the Pontiac Cemetery, I wonder if it's because of the Turk family, being they were a prominent family there. Curious. Don't know the answer to that, though. Another interesting fact is the William Scripps purchased a lot of land from the Hadrills, which then he started Wildwood Farm. And there's one of the old farmhouses is still in Canterbury Village. That is one of the Hadrills, as well as another barn on Hemingway Road as well that's still up. So there's generations of Hadrills still in the area. I still see the names floating around. So it's good to see there's generations and generations of the Hadrills still around. So our next plot that I think we want to visit is the Gengels. I've seen the Gengel name everywhere. We have Gingeville.
Yes.
And every time I pass the cemetery, I see the names of the Gengel tombstones right up front. So let's go check those out.
Okay.
Okay, now we're over at the Gengel family area, and we noticed that there was plenty of Gengel headstones. Gengel's a pretty prominent name in this area, dating back to hundreds of years, dated back. So, Cindy, could you tell me a little bit about who is buried at this Gengel cemetery?
Yes, we do have a lot of Gengels, as Jimmy mentioned. A lot are buried in this area. They're mixed with the Hadrills because a lot of the pioneers back in the day here married other family members. Coles married Hadrills, and Hadrills married Gengels, etc. So we have a lot, and over here to the back, over there, we have Mr. Walter Gengel, who I mentioned before, was the person who lived the longest. He lived to be 101, and he's buried over there, and a lot of other his other family members as well.
That's amazing. 101 years old, the oldest Gengel at Square Lake Cemetery. So, from what I could find online, like we know Frank Gengel and Ella McVeigh, they got married in 1927. And the McVeigh was also a prominent family in the area. And so, like Cindy was saying, some of the original pioneers getting married to other pioneer families. So the Frank Gengel and Ella McVeigh, they purchased 5 acres back on Baldwin Road, and they formed 62 plats, and they called it Gengelmont. It's either, if I'm pronouncing it right, Gengelmont or Gengelmont. So there was many of the homes on Baldwin. They were built by their 2 sons, Frank and Harold Gengel. And a unique fact I didn't know about was that during like the Depression time, 1929, 1932, they did a great thing where they cashed in their insurance policies, and they started farming and raising cattle, growing food for the people in their area, which is Gingeville. People would come to the store, and they would give them free food to survive during that Depression era, which I thought that was very unique. There's a lot of Gengels in the area still. They're very active in government. For example, Mike Gengel, who's the Oakland County Commissioner, he's active as well in government. So a pretty prominent name in this area still, and it's hard to miss a Gengel in this area. There's always somebody that knows a Gengel. Next, we're going to move on, and we'll talk about more about the cemetery. So, Cindy, is there any interesting plots in this area, in the cemetery, that you can share with us?
Yes. So right now we're standing on the plot, the family plot for the Dickman family. And this is where I spoke about earlier that little Fanny Dickman, who was 2 years old when she passed in 1847. She is buried in this area. So her marker is missing now, but I believe her to be buried right here. This is her mother's marker here, Lydia Dickman. And when Lydia died in 1898, she had 10 children, and 5 of them deceased before she did. So one of the other children is Catherine. She was only a year when she died as well. And then Mr. Dickman is right here. His stone has fallen to the ground, but that is John Dickman, little Fanny's father.
Great. Would you happen to know anything about like their prominence in Lake Orion, the Dickman family?
They had a son, the Dickmans had a son named John, who left and went to the Tennessee for the war, the Civil War, and he passed away right away in Tennessee. There's a marker here too for him in his honor, but he really was buried in Tennessee.
Okay, gotcha. Interesting. This will wrap it up here at the Square Lake Cemetery. Thank you, Cindy, for being able to free up your time to be interviewed about the history of the cemetery. And it's great to have some answers to some of the buildings that we see here, as well as these large, elaborate plots that we see, and of the prominent people that lived here in Lake Orion. So thanks. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
ONTV invites you to take part in our 10-week video production class. The class meets on Monday nights from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. and offers instruction on studio production, field production, and non-linear editing. Upon completion of the class, you get access to ONTV's facilities and equipment to produce your own program or short film. The cost is $30 for Lake Orion residents, $60 for non-residents. For more information, give ONTV a call at 248-393-1060 or visit orionontv.org today.
Today, we are at the Evergreen Cemetery, and we figured for this month we'd cover who are the founding pioneers of Lake Orion, Canandaigua. So we have a guest, Shoei Howie. So I'm glad we're able to interview you. And some of the questions we had were about Evergreen Cemetery in general. Like, when did this cemetery start?
It started a long time ago. It was in, I don't look up the exact date, but obviously 1894 this was built. He didn't get a permit. He just got tired of waiting for a permit and put this in. It was moved because the dam was moved and the road was moved, and it went through part of the cemetery. And this is the older part. This is the newer part. And this vault has a few people in it. You can see there's a roller in there for moving coffins in and out. It was used as temporary storage when people died in the wintertime before they had earth-moving equipment. So people were temporarily housed here. That brings me to another question. These people are more or less homeowners. You kind of think, like, who owns this place? And it is the village. The village owns it and operates it. It also belongs to the descendants. And when we did that tour maybe 10 years ago, there are 2 descendants from this. And I'm not old enough to have met anybody in this cemetery, really, I think. But there are still people who are, relatives and people who grieve for people. The storm we had a few years back was the second time this was hit by a wind shear, and the first time it was upended, put in, bones were exposed. Nowadays, most people are buried in a coffin inside a vault, so that's not an issue. Can you be buried here? It's pretty much full. It's not a really active cemetery. There aren't very many plots left. I have seen some activity, mostly just putting an extra date on the stone. What are some of the other questions?
Yeah, so that's interesting. That's good to know. I didn't know what the history was of the cemetery and how vast and large it is. I noticed that there's multiple plots divided by the street. Could you tell us, like, the information about on the other side of the cemetery? Like, is there a reason why there's 2 divisions?
Just the street.
Oh, just the street. Okay.
That area, this is actually a fairly small cemetery. The one in Oxford is larger and it could expand. So a lot of the people who were residents of Orion are actually buried in Oxford, just because it was a bigger place. The plots over there have edges around them, concrete edges and initials in the corners, which is fascinating. And there's some, you've all heard of the Masons. There's a Woodsman's marker over there, and that is pretty cool. Of course, there used to be a fence over there because everybody was dying to get in.
Yep.
Okay. But that's not there anymore. We don't really know how far out the bodies are in there, and you're not allowed to do rubbings. You're not allowed to put your pokey stick in, and this is managed by the village, and they have regulations. You're not supposed to eat in here. There's other things you can't do. Of course, a lot of people take an ice cream cone around, and that's acceptable. No garbage. Try to be respectful, even though this is, we can get a little campy with it. But a lot of history of our area in here. There's a tomb over there of a man who actually was with Michigan Agricultural College, and he developed ways of draining swamps for farmland. So he literally changed the face of the earth around here. So
what are some other pioneers that are laid to rest here?
we have Blanche Sims. I call her the most famous woman in town because everybody has said her name at least once in their lifetime. There's carpenters and webbers over here. A lot of people from the stores that used to be here. Of course, there's always a lot of fires, in town. And so some of the buildings that had these people's names on them are gone. There was also a fire in the village offices. So the list that I got from the village of who is buried in here is incomplete. It was only done, I think it was the DAR that went around it's called walking the cemetery. They just walked and looked at stones. But I have found a whole lot more people buried in here than that list. And so it's nice to remember people. Another question I get asked is, do I want a big tombstone? And like, no, not really.
You mentioned earlier that you have one of your favorite clocks.
Yes.
Let's go visit that one real quick. It's a show. He brought us over to a tombstone here of, I'm reading it here, a Nellie Frances Aldridge.
People ask me what my favorite is, and this is a little girl. She's just 12 years old, and she's from Iowa, and this was a long time ago. What's the date again?
1883, born and passed 1896.
So she didn't come here in the family sedan, and came a long way. She died in Harper Hospital in Detroit, and I can only assume that she came here for some kind of a treatment, and I cannot find any of her relatives here. So I kind of make the story a picture in my mind that she was left here. This is a very expensive style of marker, okay? And they probably left her here and were never able to come back. So I always like to visit her, and there's a beautiful poem on the back.
Oh, would you like to read that? What's the poem say?
Full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed cave of ocean bare. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness in desert air.
Nice poem. So besides your favorite one here, this young 12-year-old that passed, you mentioned earlier about Blanche Sims and carpenters.
She's over here.
Okay.
One of the carpenters, I'm assuming they're with carpenter school, is the oldest death certificate I found, and she died in 1899. To give you another idea of how this. Let's go over and look at the famous Blanche Sims.
Yeah. So we're here over at the Blanche Sims headstone. You've probably heard of Blanche Sims Elementary and Carpenter Elementary. Some of the names of schools named after these pioneers. So Blanche Sims, what do we know about her and her?
She was, again, I mostly know these people from death certificates. Okay? And I was just going to pause and say this is fairly clean. Cleaning this is against the regulations, and you need to be, even with the grant ones, you need to be very, very careful with this. They're meant to last forever. But there are people here who remember her, and that's worthy of respect from people.
I knew Blanche Sims. She lived on the corner of Shadbolt and Lapeer Street there, and I knew Mrs. McGuffey and all of those people. And I was thinking the other day about it. There's 5 great teacher friends of mine. They were all never married. And I got to wonder why they never married. There was 5 teachers.
There's a reason for it. There's a historical
There must be a
for that.
reason for it, but they
Because
took good
when-
care of me. I think they mothered their children
Yeah.
in class, and
Yeah.
I think that's where they got their satisfaction.
They enjoyed their independence, but they enjoyed
When I was starting school, all 12 grades were in that building,
What can you tell us about
kindergarten
Miss
through
Sims?
12.
What can you tell us about Miss Sims?
Mrs. Sims, she was a wonderful woman, and somewhere, maybe the library, they got a picture of her.
Uh-huh.
She's got the gray hair, and that's who she was.
Oh yeah? Did she have gray hair when she taught you?
Well, she was just a pleasant-looking elderly person.
Uh-huh.
And she lived, well, my mom lived, bought the house right across the street from her,
Yeah,
107 Lapeer Street.
Didn't she live with her sister?
Yeah, she did. She
Yeah,
had a
her
sister that
sister-in-law.
lived there as
Yeah.
well.
And to be, you know, not throwing garbage around here and things like that. It is kind of a parkland, and it's a precious place for all of us, and a real resource. But we need to remember that it also is the final resting place for a lot of people. Over there is somebody I would like to have met. Her name was Dorothy, and apparently she went by Dot and always wore polka dots.
Interesting.
Okay?
Just love
I guess I was like, you know, what a card! What a
Yeah.
person you'd want to meet and enjoy her company.
She lived in the downtown, or?
I guess she lived in the downtown. That was a long, long time ago. I spoke to with one person, and apparently she was quite a card.
Yeah.
The town had, of course, the summer population, large summer population, and not many of those people were buried here. I mean, we just death certificates online, and got to recognize a lot of summer people going through, you know, moving to different cemeteries, a lot of them in Detroit. And this place holds its own against some of the larger Detroit cemeteries in terms of the quality of the stones, in terms of the age range here. It doesn't have the governors or the senators in it, but it's also a lot quieter, and it's a good place for students to learn about their history. There's a lot of place names in here, a lot of streets, and
Yeah, I recognize, like, there was an Axford that I saw. Just an Axford Street that goes right through here that divides the cemetery.
and the experts are, you know, they were on here. The Hemingways.
Yep.
This is my favorite cause of death. Mr. Hemingway dropped dead.
That dropped it.
Okay.
And yeah, I heard Hemingway has a long history as well.
Oh, the Hemingway family was big here. We have Predmore's, you know, the Predmore
Yeah.
house downtown. A lot of the street names, and again, as I said, the early merchants, the early farmers. When you look at a plat map of this area, in the beginning, you see, you know, amazing people. The Hawkswells, of course. There's no town without the Hawkswells. And they actually bought these trees originally and planted them. Back to the FAQs, no murders. I find no murders in here, so it kind of X's off the creepy stuff again. I find it very peaceful and relaxing here. It's just fun to walk through here and look at all this. I get easily distracted.
Same here.
there's-
There's so many names
There's
that
so
pop
many
out.
names and so many
Yep.
people that I just want to know more. I just want to know more about these people. Is it time to go across the street?
Yeah, let's check out across the street real quick.
Okay,
See
cool.
what names are over there.
That cemetery over there, there's a water faucet up on top of that hill. They never shut it off in the winter. We turn it on, the icy hill there, we go down there with our sleds, go right out on the canal.
You ask about the carpenters and the carpenter school,
Yes.
and there are a whole lot of carpenters around here, but I don't know that much about them.
Yeah, well, this whole plot area, yeah, every stone that I see here has carpenters on it, and there's one in specific that I was looking for, Rolla C. Carpenter. It's Rolla, Rolla. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it right. But so he's had a very prominent history with, he was born 1852, died in 1919, but he's very well educated, went to the Michigan State Agricultural College back when it was called
Go green, go
that,
white.
yeah. So now called MSU.
MAC.
Yep.
Yes.
Now called MSU, and he was like the pioneer and worked with William Beale to set up Collegeville, they called it, and which is now East Lansing.
Awesome.
Yeah, and just to balance it out, he also got 2 other degrees at U of M. So
Okay.
he got degrees from U of M, Michigan State,
The
and
original house divided.
yes, original house divided and very prominent, and to come out of Lake Orion, which is great, and he kind of showed us some of the other prominent plots. There's some Winters that are buried here, as well as Predmore. And you said something about Predmore too that was interesting. What was that?
There's his house downtown, has a sign up there. There's so many stories in here.
Yeah.
And I just remembered another frequently asked question now. The Spanish influenza jumped all over this town. There was only one person who died of it, and he was in the service, and he was out of state. So,
Yeah.
it what goes around comes around kind of thing.
Yeah.
We're back with the pandemic situation, and just amazing here. Thank you so much for taking an interest in this.
Yeah, thank you for being our guest and showing us, opening our eyes to the founding fathers and women and children, Lake Orion.
Thank you.
Cemetery.
Happy Halloween.
Thank you.